Now let's um, see the taxonomy of artificial neural networks. So the neurons will, when connected together, they will form a network. And you will hear of this network, that network, and so on. So what are the things which differ one network from another? So you can say that there are three main criteria. The first one is the properties of the neuron or the cell. So what is the threshold that it uses? Does it use a threshold? What is the activation function? The type of activation function. So you would hear a lot about sigmoid, about ReLU. What is the architecture of the network? What is the architecture of the network or topology? Is it a feed-forward network, a recurrent network? And the third criteria which distinguishes one artificial neural network from another is the learning mechanism or the learning rules. So as we said, the information is stored in the weight. And so which learning rule are you going to use? How are you going to adjust your weights? How are you going to update them? And these are the three main criteria. And of course, you have the type of implementation, whether it's a software implementation of your artificial neural network, or it is implemented on FPGA, digital hardware, analog, or digital. So these are the three main. So let's look at the topology. So you have three main types of topology. You have a single layer network where you have an input and you just have one single layer. So each input is connected to all, this is a fully connected network, to all the neurons here. And then this network, this input is connected to all the neurons, so fully connected. And then you have your output here. You can have multiple layers. So you have the first layer of, so your input, and then the first layer of the first hidden layer, and then the second hidden layer, and then your output. Or you can have the third category, which is a recurrent network. So without hidden units, so you go straight from your output to back to your input. So this output is fed back to here, to here, and to here, and to here, okay? And then you're going to need to have a delay, unit delay operator. You can also have in your recurrent network, you can have some hidden units, okay? These are the three main categories of, three main types of topologies. Now, before we talk about, so we talked about the topology, we would like to talk about the neuron, but before we go to the artificial neuron, let's look at the biological neuron. So the structure of the neuron that you find in the human brain would be, so you would have a cell. So this is your neuron, nervous cell, neuron, and then you have your nucleus, just like most of the cells. And then you have the dendrites, which are the input. So you have a dendrite from here, and then the information is gathered at the synapses. It is processed by the nucleus, and then it's fed through the axon or the output to the next, and then this axon, the end of these branches here are connected to another neuron, the dendrites of another neuron, and then the information is processed again at the other neuron. So a neuron has a cell body, okay? This is your cell body. A branching input, the dendrite. So the difference, so between the output, the dendrite is the input. So that's why you have an I here for input. The axon is the output, okay, OO. So it has a branching input structure, the dendrite. And this is it. So this is your dendrite. And then a branching output or structure, which is the axon. This is your output. And the axon connects to dendrites via synapses. So this is how the connection is made at the synaptic level. And at the synapses, electrochemical signals are propagated from the dendritic input through the cell body and down the axon to other neurons, okay? And then when you have a neuron, it receives all that info, all this chemical signals, electrochemical signals, and it only fires if its signal, input signal, exceeds a certain amount, a certain threshold in a short time period. So you say that the neuron has fired or not fired, depending on that threshold. And synapses vary in strength. So you may have good connections allowing a large signal. You can have slight connections which allow a weak signal. And the synapses can be either excitatory or inhibitory. So this is how, so this is the nerve impulse, which is propagated. So this is the axon, the output from the previous cells. And then the information is exchanged, or the input from this axon to the input to the dendrites here happens at the synapses, okay? And these are receptor molecules. So this is the dendrite of receiving neuron. So it receives information from the axon, goes to the dendrite, and goes to the next neuron for processing. You can have neurons come in many shapes. So you can have a one axon and then lots of dendrites. You can have a lot bigger axons. See, these are the branches out in a very large number of dendrites. And then you can have also in C, you can have, this is your neuron, your axon, and then just small dendrites. And then you can have the opposite. So here, these are inputs and then just cells here, which process the information and so on. So this is biology. The brain's plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to alter its neural pathways. So this is a very interesting property of the brain. Recovery from brain damage. So the dead neurons are not replaced, but branches of the axons of healthy neurons can grow into the pathways and take over the functions of damaged neurons. And then you have also equipotentiality. More than one area of the brain may be able to control a given function. So the function is not allocated to just one certain area. It is, it can happen in different regions of the brain. And the younger the person, the better the recovery. Recovery from, for example, left hemispherectomy. So the dissection or whatever of the hemisphere, the left hemisphere. Now we've seen the different architectures or topologies, feed forward, recurrent. You have one hidden layer, several hidden layers, and the same thing for recurrent network. We've talked about the biological neuron. Now let's talk about the artificial neuron or model of the neuron. So neuron is an information processing unit in our case, a set of synapses or connecting links characterized by weight or strength. So this is what you have. So you have your input. You have these inputs are weighted. So X1, W, K1, K for this cell here, W1, X2, W2. So they're added together, they're weighted. So these inputs are weighted and then added here. So that's why you have a set of synapses or connecting links characterized by weight or strength, and other, this other here, which sums the input signals weighted by synapses. So it sums them. So it takes X1, WK1, X2 W plus X2 W2, X3 W3. So it sums them, it adds them together. And you have an activation function also called squashing function. So it's called squashing function because it limits the output of some to some finite values. So you have an activation function. So you have the input weighted, you add to it a bias, and then that output, that activation, so goes through an activation function, phi, which squashes or limits the output to some finite values. This is your function phi. This is the squashing function or the activation function. And then you have the output of the neuron. So this neuron here takes the input, processes it into this manner here, and gives you the output y, this output y, okay? So analogy, input represents the synapses. So these are the synapses. The weights represent the strengths of the synaptic link. These weights represent the weights of the synaptic link. Wi represent the dendrite secretion. The summation block represents the addition of the secretion. So you're adding these secretions here. And then the output represents the axon voltage. So this is your output, the axon. So you have the dendrites and then the axon here. So that was a nonlinear model of a neuron I. Why it is a nonlinear model? Because your activation function, so this is a linear function. So you're just summing and adding. So summation is a linear function. So your output V is a linear function. But then we're talking about the nonlinear model because of this activation function, as we're going to see, it is not linear, okay? That was model one, where you have your bias here, separate from this. Another model is where you have your bias as W0, okay? So it's just like if you have an input here, X0 with a value 1, and then your bias W0, and so your instead of having plus B here, you have sum, the VK, this VK is the sum, this sum here, of W xj. So X0 W0 plus X1 W1 plus X2 W2 and so on. You don't have the bias here. And you're going to have your V here at the output of the summing junction. And then you're going to have your activation function, which is going to give you an output. Again, this is a nonlinear model because of this, the nonlinearity of this activation function. So let's now talk about the activation function, the type of activation functions. So you have different types which have been used. Some work better than others. So the first one is the hard limiting threshold function, which corresponds to the biological paradigm. So you either have fire or not fire. So if your input is less than a certain threshold, the output is 0. If it exceeds that threshold, the output is 1, okay? So if the input is greater than a threshold, then the output is 1. If it's greater than this threshold, the output is 1. If it is less than the threshold, the output is 0. You can have also piecewise linear function. So it's not, doesn't go from 0 to 1 in at the threshold, but it goes in a linear fashion. So between this point and this point, you have a line. That's why it's called piecewise linear. One line, one line, one line. You can have a sigmoid function, which looks like an S, so it's an S-shaped curve. The function is defined by this formula here, 1 over 1 plus exponential minus AV. And this A determines the slope of parameters, so how deep is or this slope here. The good thing about this function is differentiable, which is important for our backpropagation algorithm, okay? Actually, this should be in here instead of V, but you got the idea. So this is the input, okay? Activation functions, so the threshold or step function was used by McCulloch and Pitts model. The linear function, so this was used by McCulloch and Pitts. This linear function was used in the other line, okay? Neurons using a linear activation function are called in the literature other line, adaptive linear. So that they were introduced by Widrow in 1960. Widrow has an amazing paper actually, which is very easy to, makes it very easy to understand the whole thing. And then the sigmoid functions with more, which more exactly describe the nonlinear functions of the biological neuron. These are the ones. And again, they have the advantage of being differentiable, which help the backpropagation algorithm. So this is again the activation function. This is our input V, and it's given by 1/1 plus exponential minus beta V. So beta is the slope here. So as we said, if beta V goes to infinity, if this beta V goes to infinity, then our output goes to 1. If it goes to minus infinity, it goes to 0, and you can replace it here. You can see that this function, when beta V goes to minus infinity, this function goes to 0. And then beta, if beta goes to infinity, if beta is large and V is fixed, so for the same beta, so beta V or phi beta V or eta goes to 1. 1 is the modified Heaviside function. This is the Heaviside function, okay, which has 1 when the input is positive or equal to 0, and 0 when the input is negative. But the modified Heaviside function is as this value. So it's 1 when it's positive, 0 when it's negative, and 1/2 at 0. Okay, so this is the Heaviside modified function. Other activation functions include, so if we've seen here, these activation functions, they go from 0 to 1. Now, there are other functions which whose output is -1 or +1. So this is the signum function, the sine function. So if the input is less than 0, it's negative. If the output is greater than 0, it's +1 or -1 here. You can have a hyperbolic tangent function, and this is again a differentiable, which is good, but the input as opposed to the sigmoid is not 0. It's not 0 and 1, it's -1 and +1. You can also have a stochastic model of a neuron. So far we have introduced only deterministic models of artificial neural networks, meaning that the activation, the neuron has a deterministic function, activation function, but we can have a stochastic or probabilistic model. And that's done this way. So if X denotes the state of a neuron, or actually this is if this denotes, or eta denotes the state of a neuron, then P of V denotes the probability of firing a neuron. So instead of having, if the neuron is greater than a certain threshold, it fires, and if it's less, it doesn't fire. Now we can say that it fires with a certain probability. This is the probability here. So where V is the induced activation potential, bias, linear combination. So the T is a pseudo temperature. This T here is a pseudo temperature used to control the noise level, and therefore the uncertainty in firing. So if t goes to 0, your stochastic model goes to the deterministic, approaches a deterministic model. So you can, if you replace here t by 0, you can see that your output is a deterministic model, +1 or -1. +1 if it's greater than or equal than 0, -1 if it's less than 0. Okay, so this is your, this becomes a deterministic, instead of having a stochastic model, you're going to have a deterministic model if your t is equal to 0. And that's why this t here is used to control the noise level, the uncertainty in firing. Now let's look at decision boundaries. So we've seen first the topology of a network. We've seen the properties of the neuron, namely you can say that we talked about the bias and the activation function and the different types of activation functions, sigmoid, probabilistic or not, the sign, and so on. So we've seen a number of activation functions. Now, before we go to the learning rule, let's look at the decision boundaries. So in simple cases, you divide the feature space by drawing a hyperplane across it. So for example, if you want to, if this is your feature space, x1 corresponds to a certain feature, x2 corresponds to a certain feature, and these features, and so to distinguish between one class and another, you can just draw a line. Okay, so in simple cases, you can divide the space or the feature space by drawing a hyperplane across it. So a line in the planar case and the hyperline in our hyperplane in the case of a multidimensional feature space. Okay, and this line here is known as the decision boundary. The discriminant functions returns different values on opposite side. So if it belongs to a, so on this side of the decision boundary, your discriminant function will give you a certain value. If it's on the other side of the decision boundary, you're going to have a different value on, so different value on the opposite side. And the problems which can be thus classified are linearly separable. So in this case, you have linearly separable, as opposed to this case here, in this feature space, as we've seen in the case of the XOR, for example, you cannot have one line that will separate the pluses from the minuses. So there is no way you can find a linear function, or a linear discriminant function which is going to divide this space. So the perceptron is able to represent some useful functions, like the AND OR. Okay, so if you want to look for the AND of x1 and x2, but if you choose your weights with a perceptron equal, so the bias would be -1.5 and W1 and W2 is equal to 1, you can use the perceptron to model your end function. But functions that are not linearly separable, for example, the XOR, are not capable of, you cannot use the perceptron to do that, to represent them. And that's where at some point, as we've seen in the history, when some researchers discovered that, then that killed the area of artificial neural network for a while. So linear separability, so this is class A, this is class B again. So you have a number of points. And this is their class. So you have the first point, X1, Y1 belongs to class A, and this one, X2 belongs to class A, and so on. And then, but these points belong to another class B. And this is the decision boundary. So this is a linearly separable problem. We can separate class A from class B just by drawing a line. And this line here is, so if this is x1 and x2, which is x1 and x2, so the decision boundary is given by this function here. And these are the weights of your perceptron, okay? So W1, W2, and you have your threshold or your bias. So this is your, now, example to illustrate what is a feature space. So for example, here you have the weight of a person, the height of a person. So if the weight is high and the height is high, then you can say that this is a rugby player. If the weight is low and the height is low, you can say that these are ballet dancers, okay? And so you would be able to find in this feature space, in this two-dimensional feature space, a decision boundary, a line which separates the two classes, okay? Rugby players from ballets. So you can do that by training a neuron. So again, so we have a perceptron. So so this is our perceptron. This is our input. This is so we have -1 here. We have a threshold, and then this is our first input weighted by W1. This is our second input weighted by W2. We sum the whole thing, so it's x0 W0 plus x1 W1 plus x2 W2 equals 0. And we've set here x1, x0 equal to -1, so that, and W0 is equal to 0, so that when we do that, so we say that if x1 W1 plus x2 W2 is greater than the threshold, then the neuron would fire, would give us a +1. If it is less than a certain threshold, it gives us -1. So our output is not 0 and 1, it's -1 and +1. And then so when we train our network, we give it, so we have a data set, we feed that, training set, and then we feed that training set to be able to find, that's why we have a question mark here, these weights, okay? We find the bias, we'll find these weights as well, and that would allow us to learn to find what is the best decision boundary. So we find these W1, W2, and T which allows us to find the boundary, the decision boundary, which is able to, or helps us to classify the samples which belong to class A and the samples which belong to class B. So it is clear that if X1 and X2 belong to class A, so your X1 W1 plus X2 W2 is greater than T. If it belongs to B, it is less than T. And then training your neuron will consist of finding the WIs, okay? We're going to see later how to do that. We stop here. Thank you.